This video was made possible thanks to InVideo AI. More details coming up very soon. The savior of Europe, the rockstar president with whom all the other presidents want, or at least wanted, to have their picture taken. Visualeconomik community, the president of France is all that, and much more. Emmanuel Macron. Macron arrived at the Élysée Palace as a centered guy, removed from the eccentric ideologies that the French are so fond of. We're talking about a guy who came from working in Rothschild Bank, not from doing university occupations or sticking up posters for a political party. Emmanuel Macron sold himself as the business-friendly reformer coming to lead France out of years of social discontent and economic stagnation. Macron promised to cut public spending, stabilize the deficit, end the privileges of big business, and prove that it isn't set in stone that the lowest unemployment rate you can have is 7%. And as we say around here, no sooner said than done. In his first year in office, Macron reduced the deficit by more than 1 point, bringing it below the maximum allowed by European authorities to 2.3%. He also achieved this milestone while lowering some significant taxes, such as corporate income tax, from 33% to 25%. But this was not his greatest achievement, because we've already talked about this in a video or two. But you should know that in 1977, France doubled the size of its state. Yes, that's right. In just 1 year, the public sector went from occupying 20% of the economy to 40%. The reason? Basically, in the 1970s, France experienced several crises, and to correct them, the government approved a large aid package. But of course, when the storm passed, you can imagine that no one was happy to stop being paid. These days, France is the liberal democracy with the largest public sector in the world, at over 55%. It's become a clear example of what is known as Parkinson's law. It is very easy to approve increases in public spending, but decreases? Let's see which politician dares to take away an allowance or a permanent civil servant position from someone who already recognizes it as if it were a fundamental human right. Basically like you want to take away life itself. You've already seen what happened with the Prime Minister, a vote of no confidence for wanting to cut back more than necessary, but we'll talk about that later. The fact is, among all these aid measures, there were unemployment subsidies that were extremely generous, perhaps the most generous in Europe, since France allocates almost 2.5% of its GDP to them, while in countries as disparate as Spain, Italy, and Germany, they barely exceed 1.5%. The result, unemployment in France went from 2% to 8%, and since then, it has been oscillating for 40 years without falling below 7%. We aren't saying that all this rise was due to unemployment benefits. Obviously, the main culprit was the oil crisis and everything that followed, but it is quite likely that these subsidies, and having labor costs like those of the Netherlands being 25% poorer, were the main reasons why the figure didn't go down again once the storm had passed. It is in this context that Macron achieved something that seemed impossible: to single-handedly get a handle on unemployment. Unemployment fell from 9.5% to 7.3%, practically a record since 1983. And if we look at more complex indicators, such as the one you are seeing on the screen, the result does not change. Macron fulfilled his electoral promises to the letter. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. There were protests in France, of course, but protesting was always the country's national pastime. That was inevitable. But why are we telling you all of this? So that you will be more surprised by news like this.
France loses the label of safe haven country, and its risk premium rises to the periphery group. The bond yield stands at 3%, close to Greece's 3.15% and above the rates paid by Spain and Portugal.
Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, all the debt rating agencies have downgraded France. In other words, France is getting out of control. So much so that, well, you'd better hear it directly from one of the president's top economic advisors.
The economic policy followed by Emmanuel Macron was not a bad strategy, but it did not work.
Well, in his initial years, Macron experienced the closest thing to a honeymoon that a French president could have. Right now, his situation could not be worse. But we aren't only talking about the situation of the president. France itself is not going through its best times, and what is worse, no one seems to be able to fix it. You could say that the French economy is proving as disappointing as the arrival of Kylian Mbappe at Real Madrid Football Club. Macron's economic plan has failed, but on the other hand, the alternatives are no better. Both Le Pen's plans on the extreme right and those of Mélenchon on the extreme left are so terrifying that they would probably scare Freddy Krueger himself. So the questions are clear. If Macron started out so well, what has happened that the French economy is falling apart? To what extent is the president to blame? And perhaps the most important question of all, will we see a solution soon? After years of making YouTube videos, I've seen just how much goes on behind the scenes. Recently, we found a game-changing tool, InVideo AI. InVideo AI V3 brings advanced generative features, enabling you to express your ideas in the form of stunning videos, just like we do. The kind you've always wanted to create. The kind you'd be excited to share within your peers, in the most seamless, intuitive way possible, irrespective of whatever skill level you are at. For example, you can ask it to create a 45-second emotional commercial about candles in soft anime style.
Inspired by your favorite anime. Let the scent transport you.
But that's just the beginning. InVideo AI V3's generative capabilities can bring any idea to life, whether it's dramatic stories, product ads, educational content, and more. Unlike traditional video tools with steep learning curves that only solve for parts of your video creation process, InVideo removes all friction, letting users focus entirely on their vision and their idea. With unique features like voice cloning to narrate your videos in your own voice, it sets a new standard for video creation. And here's the best part. You can try InVideo AI for free. But if you want to use their generative capabilities, I highly recommend that you go for the generative plan that starts at $96 a month. It's the one that I have, and gives you the most bang for the buck, with 15 generative minutes. This will save you hundreds of dollars that you would otherwise spend on editing, animating, and other production costs. If you're already an InVideo user, you can simply go to the add-on section and buy generative seconds. And now, back to the video. Let me start with a question. Who governs France today? It seems simple, right? Macron. Well, yes, but no. Just a few months ago, after the failure at the European elections, Macron dissolved the National Assembly and called for early elections. Let the French people decide the future of France. And so they did decide. It wasn't just that Macron lost these elections, it's that he came third, behind both the extreme left and the extreme right, which was the winner of the elections. Nevertheless, the president still had an ace up his sleeve, the second round. And this is when he played four-dimensional chess with the rest of the parties. Macron reached a pact with several left-wing parties not to step on each other's toes, and taken advantage of French constituencies, which only send one deputy each, he crushed Marine Le Pen. This move was a success for the president, although the official winner was the Leftist Alliance, which went from second to first place. After this, everyone expected Macron to appoint a left-wing prime minister. After all, he had correctly allied himself with the left in the second round. But no, Macron surprised everyone by appointing the conservative Michel Barnier. Naturally, the left-wing politicians of the New Popular Front, who did not know how to read the situation and negotiate properly, were also to blame. In short, what seemed to be a victory for the left ended up being a victory for Le Pen, who, if you'll pardon the expression, has had Macron's government firmly in her grip. The best example of this just unfolded in the last few hours. And this is not just us saying so. The president himself is very clear about the weakness of his government.
The French National Assembly has just toppled Barnier's government with votes from both the left and the far right.
Uncertainty is at an all-time high, and that is largely why the French risk premium has outrated the Spanish one. And it also explains why the French stock market has lost a year of growth. Of course, if I were to end the explanation here, well, what can I say? We would be falling very short. I mean, it's clear that nobody likes uncertainty, but that's not enough to explain why France is doing so badly. And worse, why the markets don't expect it will improve much in the near future. And this is where the structural factors and others born of Macronism come into play. We've already talked about the structural ones, but let me emphasize them more. Here is the distribution of French companies according to their size. What is most striking is that there is a massive jump between the number of companies with 49 and 50 employees. The reason? France imposes very rigid labor laws on companies starting at 50 workers. So many, in order not to face these laws, stop hiring at 49. In view of this, it would be logical to think that France is a country that takes great care of small and medium-sized companies, wouldn't it? After all, look how it punishes the big ones with terrible regulations. But no, nothing could be further from the truth. If there's one thing that makes French capitalism stand out, it's that the state puts all its efforts into taking care of its great champions, such as one or another automobile brand that I'm sure I don't need to be naming. And this shouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. South Korea, for example, has also invested heavily in large companies. But there's a difference. In Korea, large companies are very dynamic and competitive. Kia, for example, went bankrupt and was replaced by Hyundai. In France, however, the laws shield existing large companies while preventing other large companies from coming into existence and competing with them. So far, the French model has managed to work well thanks to very cheap nuclear energy. Even so, the world is very different from what it was 20 years ago. After the rise of China, French companies started to lose a lot of market share. And let me ask you, do you know of any French technology company that is as cutting edge as the American ones? Yes, there is Mistral in the field of artificial intelligence, but not much else. France must adapt or die. And there is not much good news here. In the last 4 years, for example, corporate profits from R&D investment have fallen by half compared to the previous period. Everything indicates that they are lagging behind in the race to innovate. The reason? Perhaps it comes down to them spending more time on political lobbying than on being better than the competition. Do you want an example?
Carrefour will no longer sell meat from Mercosur countries. The French supermarket chain Carrefour announced that it will no longer buy or sell beef from countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay in support of local producers who protested against the free trade agreement between Mercosur and the EU.
Indeed, protectionism is one of the star themes of French foreign policy. Because yes, the French model revolves around big business, but that doesn't mean that the government doesn't need to spend millions of euros to quell the revolts of small and medium-sized farmers. In fact, do you remember the Yellow Vests protests? Maybe not, because they don't make so much noise anymore. And the reason they don't make so much noise is because Macron gave in and approved a minimum wage hike, several tax breaks, and even asked companies to be more generous with extra pay. In short, French companies have a serious productivity problem that they have been deferring into the future. But it stands to reason that you can't do that indefinitely. However, not all problems come from far away. Pay attention to this chart. Remember how Macron reduced France's deficit? Well, look what happened next. During the pandemic, the deficit grew from 2.54% to 8.9%. Yes, it was a special circumstance, and all countries increased their deficits, but France took the cake. And do you also remember Parkinson's law? It turns out that reversing the public spending of those years has been a huge headache, meaning that today the deficit is still twice the limit set by European fiscal discipline. That's right, we must give Macron credit for one thing. The French president has indeed made very, very unpopular cuts in public spending. There is the adjustment in the retirement age and the tweaks to the medieval privileges that many guilds had, and no, medieval is not a metaphor here. Unfortunately, this hasn't been enough. Now then, hold on a moment, because Macron is a serious politician, a statesman, or at least that's how he presents himself to his voters. And that's why he has, or perhaps it's better to say he had, a plan to solve this issue, the Barnier Plan. Barnier was the new Prime Minister of France, whom Macron appointed against all odds. This is the same man who has now been toppled by the first vote of no confidence against a government in France to pass since 1962. It was in his hands to approve a budget that could begin to address the deficit. And as you can see, it all ended with no budget and no Prime Minister. For now, Macron has already stated that the EU's fiscal discipline rules are, well, more like suggestions. In theory, the deficit was supposed to be under control by 2027, but even in the optimistic scenario of the Barnier plan, this wasn't expected to happen until 2029. And now? Well, now we have no idea. Bear in mind, controlling the deficit doesn't mean achieving a surplus, not even close. It just means reducing it to 3%, which is still not exactly a small figure. But let's take a closer look at what this plan involved. Do you remember the corporate tax rate that Macron lowered from 33% to 25%? Well, to begin with, France will reverse that measure. But that wasn't the only tax hike aimed at businesses, not even the most significant one. There were others, such as an 8% tax on stock buybacks, in addition to other so-called temporary taxes. Yes, temporary. Targeting companies with extraordinary profits. However, these tax increases weren't even the most important part of the adjustment.
The first remedy for debt is to reduce spending. By 2025, 2/3 of the recovery effort will come from that.
Exactly. Barnier plans to tackle this issue at its root by cutting spending, which is the right approach. On this channel, we've often discussed how fiscal adjustments are far more effective when they're achieved by reducing spending, rather than raising taxes. First, because there's a limit to how much you can raise taxes. Even if you manage to increase them once, it's difficult to pass laws that ensure they stay raised over time. What usually happens is that the budget balances for 1 year, and then the following year, it's back in the red. Second, taxes impact economic growth. Whether the effect is large or small depends on the specific tax, but either way, it doesn't help. Now, saying this is one thing, but Doing it is entirely different. The last time Macron touched pensions, France erupted in flames. And now Barnier, who plans to freeze or at least delay their adjustment to inflation, has been thrown out by the parliament. And for the rest, well, you can imagine. Eliminating redundant agencies, cutting duplications, addressing inefficiencies, basically the same thing all politicians say to avoid admitting that if they want to reduce the deficit, they'll have to cut significant budget items. But even so, it hasn't worked. The question now is, what happens next? Well, what can I say? Overall, neither the stock market nor analysts are feeling very optimistic. For starters, forget about the budget. We don't even know what kind of government Macron will be able to form now. Whatever it ends up being, it will come into power severely constrained, so the new government will likely be less ambitious. The problem is that analysts already suggested that the Barnier plan was overly optimistic to begin with. For instance, to reach the 3% deficit target by 2029, the government estimated that France would grow at 1.1%, but the OECD projects much lower growth, closer to 0.7%, and some believe that the impact of the cuts has been overestimated. According to an analyst from JP Morgan, under this plan, France would only reduce its deficit from 6.1% to 5.4% by 2025, not to 5% as originally planned. Either way, it's clear that things aren't looking great for the land of baguettes. Though, at least they can take solace in the fact that their situation isn't as dire as Germany's. Although, looking at how things are going in the French Parliament, I wouldn't bet on that comparison holding up in a few years. On one hand, there are structural problems that France hasn't done anything to address. Its industry simply isn't as competitive as it used to be. Add to that a massive deficit and an unsustainable social situation. That said, France still has excellent companies, an enviable energy mix, a fairly efficient bureaucracy, and, well, we've seen harsher adjustments recently. And yes, France isn't Argentina, but the game is far from over. But now, it's your turn. Were you aware of France's dire situation? What trick do you think Macron might pull out of his hat now? You can leave me your answer in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best, see you next time.